Greetings, my name is Monty Martin and welcome back to Isadora 101. In this series of video tutorials, I'm going to be introducing you to the core features and functionality of Isadora 3. Today, we are going to get the power running and fire up the generator actors in Isadora 3. These are amongst the most flexible and useful actors in Isadora, particularly when we are working with interactive works or when we want to automate elements of our Isadora patch. Let's talk about for a moment why these actors are just so useful and how they allow us to take precise control of what the actor properties are doing in Isadora. Bear in mind that today you will want to make sure that you've reviewed our content on using value scaling in Isadora as well as the trigger actors. So if you haven't yet caught those tutorials, I highly recommend going back and checking those ones out first, because we will be relying on some of the knowledge and information from those tutorials in our work today. In addition, I've also included a small example file that shows some of the small patches that I built with the generator actors that you can find in the links below. I'm also going to be using some of the media files from the earlier Isadora 101 videos, so if you do want to use those and follow along, check out some of those earlier videos where you can download those video files too, or you can use any media files that you might have in your own collection. Now, let's start off by looking at why we would want to use the generator actors at all in the first place, and what their purpose is. I'm just going to show my stages here. Great. And I've got just one of our video files from before playing as normal. Now, we've experimented a little bit already with the various actor properties on the projector actor. Things like adjusting the zoom value of the projector actor to get a bigger or smaller image. But we can also change things like the intensity, looking at how bright that image is. And we can even change the width and the height of this actor as well. We can also decide where exactly on the stage it's going to be placed by adjusting the horizontal and vertical position. Now, you can always type in exactly the exact values that you want to have for any of these properties, like so, just by clicking on the field and adjusting exactly where those things are going to be. In some cases, even putting the Earth very far away and off the actual stage itself. And we can always restore these back to their default values here as well. There's just a quick option there called Reset to Default Values, where you can set everything back to the original if you kind of mess things up a lot in the process of your experimentations. But now, something that you might have noticed as we adjust the values on the actor properties is that we can click the small circle beside a property and that we get a slider that we can use to adjust that value. I'm going to adjust the zoom here. And you can see that as I adjust the slider, the visual representation of what's happening updates in real time. And I actually kind of get this smooth zooming effect of either kind of going into the Earth or pulling away from it, like a Carl Sagan film. Now, we could do this manually with our fingers, but of course, the rate of control is very inconsistent. And possibly we might want to just be able to have this happen automatically or with the click of a button. Enter the generator actors for this very purpose and many, many more. Whenever we have values in an actor property that we want to shift or change in real time in response to a trigger or perhaps completely automatically, rather than needing to do this manually by clicking the slider or changing the values, we can use the generator actors to help with this, allowing us to shift from one value to the next in a gradual manner, or perhaps in some cases a more sudden manner, depending on the exact type of control that you want to create. Now, there are 5 main generator actors in Isadora, and we can find them by filtering our toolbox to the generators actors right up here. I have subcategorized these generators just for our purposes here today into our trigger activated generators and our frequency based automated generators. The trigger activated generators include the envelope generator and the envelope generator plus plus, as well as the decay generator. And our frequency based automated generators include the pulse generator and the wave generator. What's the difference between these two? Well, the envelope generator and the decay generator both rely on something within Isadora triggering them to carry out their operation, such as if we review back to our tutorial on the trigger-based actors, this might include the enter scene trigger actor, or perhaps a keyboard watcher, or any of our other actors in Isadora that can fire triggers. On the other hand, the frequency-based automated generators start working the moment they appear in the scene, and each of them ticks automatically. How fast or slow they tick is based on their frequency, which is measured in hertz. 1 hertz means 1 tick per second. We're going to explore what these mean in just a moment when we look at these pulse generators in detail, but the frequency expressed in hertz means that by having something that is, say, 10 hertz, it's going to tick or click 10 times per second, but if it's 0.5 hertz, it's going to tick once every 2 seconds. So there's a bit of math to have running in your head when you're using these actors, just to start keeping in mind as you're using them. So let's dive in and explore what we can do with the envelope generator actor. I prepared a little bit of a scene here for us to see what we might do with it. Now, I've created a simple scene here with just a movie player and a projector, and I've placed the envelope generator in the scene with a keyboard watcher plugged into its trigger input. My keyboard watcher is rigged up to press the A key, so pressing it will fire the envelope generator. Let's watch and see what happens when I press the A key. You'll notice that the envelope generator lit up and a yellow playhead moved across this visual representation of the envelope generator. But what actually happened when we did that? Well, the envelope generator is basically a graph. And when we trigger the envelope generator, the output value of the envelope generator is going to shift from one value to the next. By default, the envelope generator moves from value 0 to value 1. In this case, value 0 is 0 and value 1 is value 100. And it moves between those values, hitting every value along the way as it goes, over a rate expressed in rate 1, in this case 1 second. So let's try plugging the output of our envelope generator to one of the properties on our projector. I'm going to keep it really simple, and I'm just going to plug this rate into our intensity on our projector actor. Now let's watch and see what happens when I press the A key. You'll notice that the envelope generator caused that image to flicker right back to black and then slowly build back up to 100% intensity, creating a fade. Now, this is a little bit of an awkward fade. The video was already at 100% when we started the video, and so it went to black and then went the other way back up again. Well, what if we wanted this to fade out instead? Let's just reverse the values. I'll change value 0 from 100 and value 1 down to 0, thus reversing the direction of the envelope generator. Let's see what happens now. I've created a fade out. This is a great method to create internal fade outs and fades up within your project. And in fact, we can turn the envelope generator into a little bit of a toggle because the envelope generator can be broken up into multiple segments, which we can control in sequence. Let's see how this goes. Right now my envelope generator has only one segment. It moves from 0 to 1 or 1 to 0. But I'm going to increase these segments now to 2. And you'll see that I've created another line. I now have value 0, value 1, and value 2. This is the start point, the midpoint, and the end point of my envelope generator. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to set value 2 to 100%. And you can see that my line now is going from 100% to 0 and back to 100%. Let's see what happens when I fire it now. It went it went from 100% down to 0 and back up again. Now, that's all well and good if we wanted to create some sort of flicker like this. But maybe we want to be a little bit more controllable. Maybe we want it to get to 0, stay there, and then go back to 100 when we press the keyboard a second time. Well, this is because right now, our envelope generator is set to trigger mode all, which means that once it's triggered, it's going to go through the entire envelope and cause all those things to happen. But if we set it to one end, what will now occur with the envelope generator is that when it is pressed, it will go to the next point and stop there and wait to be triggered again. And then it will rise up once again, once we trigger it again by pressing the A key. This means that now I have a manual fader within my scene that I can control simply by pressing the A key. This is a really, really useful trick to keep in your back pocket for creating small things that you need to bring up temporarily and then bring them down again without necessarily advancing the scene into another, without necessarily advancing the entire scene. I use this all the time in my projects, and that's a handy little trick. Now, we could use this in other ways as well. We could cause this to move between the various zooms, zooming the whole thing in and back out again. Now, of course, these values are really, really extreme. We're going from, you can see now, when I press the envelope generator to trigger it, even though it's going from 0 to 100, it's connected to the zoom, which is going from 0 to 1000. So this is where we need to go back to our review of the value scaling, and we might need to adjust the value parameters of the zoom somewhat, maybe to make it match. Maybe I'm going to make it so that it doesn't go all the way to a zoom of 1000, and maybe just make it to 200. In this case now, it is going to zoom in a much more reasonable way. Maybe I don't want it to zoom out completely, so I'm going to change the minimum to 100, and now I've created something that will zoom in and zoom out just a little bit without taking the entire image out entirely. This is kind of great for a bit of a press in moment or a press out moment in the video that we're creating, and it's completely under our control when it happens or doesn't happen. So we can even use this alongside features of the projector actor like the horizontal position or vertical position to determine movement and move objects and videos around within the canvas of our projector. I encourage you to experiment with just this little patch. Spend a little bit of time playing with the minimum and maximum values of the horizontal position, vertical position, width, height, zoom, and intensity on a projector actor, and play around with having envelope generators with more or fewer segments and ones that go between the values of 100 and 0. This allows you to get really precise control of how your actor properties shift from one to the next. Now, you may be wondering, okay, what does the envelope generator plus plus do, and what's the difference? It's actually a very fine difference here. With the envelope generator, your values are always between 0 and 100 on the generator itself. But with the envelope generator plus plus, we can actually plug in values of any number. We can have negative values as well as values of 3000 or more, or 300, whatever we want. So these are all tools that you can use alongside the value scaling of Isadora to very precisely migrate between one value to the next. The other thing that I want to remind you of when you are using the envelope generator, which is very critical, is the initialize feature of the value scaling. Initialize, by checking this off, this allows us to define the value that the scene starts at for that property. And I recommend that the value 0 of your envelope generator corresponds to the initialize value of whatever it is connected to. This means that you won't get those abrupt sudden shifts that we saw when I first connected the envelope generator. It will always mean that the initial state of the envelope generator and the initial value that you have it connected to are perfectly aligned with one another, and you won't get that abrupt sort of effect when you trigger the envelope generators once you've built your patch. So that's a very important detail to bear in mind when you are using the envelope generator, and in fact almost any of the generator actors as a whole. This is a very powerful actor, and we're going to keep coming back to it in some of our future tutorials, particularly as we explore using the video effects actors. So I do recommend practicing using it so that you really get comfortable setting it up. One final interesting feature of the envelope generator is the end trigger output of the envelope generator actor itself. This end trigger can fire in one of two cases. When the trigger mode of the envelope generator is set to 1/end, this end trigger output will fire once the envelope generator reaches the very end of the sequence, like so. Alternatively, however, we can set the trigger mode to 1 individual. In this case, each segment causes that end trigger to fire once the envelope generator reaches it. Alternatively, when it is simply set to all, the envelope generator always fires once it reaches the end, and the end only. This end trigger could be used to create sequences of various triggers, and in some cases, triggering another envelope generator, like so, perhaps connected to the intensity and bringing the whole value down again. So we can actually create chains of envelope generators operating in an interesting way to create several segments of various effects that we can lock together. It's a fun and powerful tool, and one of the interesting ways that you can use this that I'm a really big fan of is to create intro and outro segments. One of my favorite ways to use an envelope generator is with the jump actor, such that once we get to the end of the envelope generator, it creates an animated effect and then fires the jump that moves into the next scene. It's a great way to create more complex build-ins and build-outs of your various scenes. Try it out. Next, we're going to look at the wave generator. And for now, I am just going to disconnect all of our properties here. And you can already see maybe a glimmer of what the wave generator is doing. The wave generator is actually kind of like the cousin of the envelope generator, in that it also scrolls from value 0 to value 100, but in this case, it is fixed to always going from 0 to 100. Instead of waiting for you to manually trigger the wave generator, however, the wave generator is just always going. And it is going at a frequency defined by the frequency property in hertz. This is the amount of time it takes the wave generator to move across its entire series of values and back to the beginning again. So by default, when we create a wave generator, it is following a sine wave, which is a gradual slope upward and then back downwards again. We can change what the wave generator's wave looks like in the wave property, and this will shift it from a sine wave to the sawtooth, which goes from 0 to 100 and then back down again quite abruptly, to the triangle, which is more gradual, similar to what we built with the envelope generator, but in this case, completely automated. We can also have it be a square, which just fluctuates back and forth from 0 to 100, or randomly, which at the end of every tick, it just picks a random value from 0 to 100. So let's see what it does, though, with the sine wave when it's connected all in here. I've put in a shapes actor connected to a projector actor, which is creating the square that we see on screen. And I put in another actor here called the color maker, which I've connected to the fill color of my shapes actor. The color maker makes color. And that is defined by the value of the hue property. You can see as I scroll through it, I'm creating the full spectrum in order through the rainbow. Once I plug the wave generator into the hue, we've got some psychedelic flashing happening there. And so the wave generator can create some very dramatic effects based on how quickly it's moving. If I create another wave generator and I plug this now into the zoom of my projector actor, we're getting a lot of flashing happening there. Let's slow things down for a moment, and let's take the frequency down to 0.1 on both of these wave generators. Now we've created something that is much more gradual. At 0.1 frequency, the wave generator actually takes as much as 10 seconds to pass through all of its values from one to the next, creating a much more gradual sort of effect in the wave generator. You can see once I change this to 1 second or 1 hertz, it's now passing across that entire zoom in a single second. Whereas at 0.1, much more gradual instead. The flow of the change of color is much slower as well. Of course, we could kick this up quite a bit and make this a lot faster, but I don't really want to blow up my retinas. So this effect with color I find is very visual and lets us see quite quickly what is happening here. And it's a lot of fun to connect the wave generator to the various properties on the projector actor or the shapes actor. But I do recommend, as you're experimenting, that you slow it down so you can really closely see what is happening and how the wave generator is affecting. This really is something that requires a lot of play to figure out what kind of effect that you're actually going to create. As a few final notes about the wave generator, it is possible to set it to only fire once, in which case it stops once it creates its wave, and then we do have to hit the reset button to trigger it again. And we can also adjust the starting point of the wave by changing the phase. And this is really useful if you're putting in multiple wave generators and you want to kind of stagger them so they're not all working perfectly in sync with one another. So the wave generator itself is kind of like an automated version of the envelope generator. Because it only goes from 0 to 100 and it can move quite quickly, it is worthwhile to take precise control of where you want to place it and decide very carefully how you want it working, because in a lot of cases at 1 hertz or faster, it can produce very sporadic effects, which are very hard to track. That might be what you want. Experiment. Moving right along, we come to the pulse generator. I like to think of the pulse generator like one of those dodo birds that Homer Simpson used in a famous episode of The Simpsons to press a key on his keyboard for him. The pulse generator is basically clicking a trigger at a rate defined by the frequency, similar to the wave generator. In this case, my pulse generator is set to 1 second, which means that it is creating a trigger every 1 second. This is a trigger that works exactly in the same way as the enter scene trigger or the trigger produced by pressing the keyboard watcher. It's just going to go in an automated fashion. Now, I've rigged up my pulse generator in a bit of a particular way to create this flashing effect with the shapes actor, simply by varying between 2 values of the intensity actor. Although we can use the pulse generator in many ways. For instance, to trigger sound effects, short ones. Plugging a pulse generator into the start of a sound watcher actor that is playing a longer sound than the frequency would indicate can yield a lot of dissonance in the moment. So be careful about using the pulse generator with a sound watcher or any sort of effects that trigger movie or media playback. In this example patch, I have created a pulse generator plugged into a sequential trigger actor. The sequential trigger allows us to create subsequent triggers, effectively breaking apart the pulse generator and triggering several events in sequence according to the pulse generator. In this specific case, I've connected my sequential triggers to an actor called the trigger value actor. Trigger value actor is actually very simple. When it's triggered, it simply plugs whatever value is in the trigger value, it's the value of the actor itself, into whatever it's connected to. So in this case, I have two trigger value actors, one at 100, one at 0, and both of them are passing their values into the intensity of the projector. Now, a quick thing to point out. What I've created here demonstrates the pulse generator actor doing its thing. But if I were to disconnect these trigger values, I could create a very similar effect by instead using a wave generator on the square wave connected right back into the intensity. And it creates almost the same thing, simply adjusting the frequency just a little bit to create the same pulse as before. Deciding when to use a wave generator and when to use a pulse generator is really going to depend on exactly what you want to achieve with your patch. Oftentimes we will use the pulse generator as a very important part of automated timings or other things like the particle generator actor, which we will explore in a future tutorial. The pulse generator is one of those kind of enigmatic actors. It's very, very useful in very specific circumstances when you need to infinitely continue triggering something in your patch at a consistent rate. But in some cases, it may be better to use a wave generator to create a similar effect, particularly when you're trying to oscillate between multiple values. In other ways, it can also be more valuable to use other triggers and send other triggers and messages in a sequential way, depending on how much you want to automate your patch. The pulse generator is an invitation to heavily automate things in lockstep. It's got a lot of creative potential, but deciding what it's plugged into is really the biggest decision you're going to make with it. Of course, you can have the pulse generator with multiple outputs. By changing the output field, we can have several triggers on the pulse generator, and you'll actually see that these triggers actually go separately in a sequential order. So once again, this little example that I've made to show the pulse generator at work is actually embedded inside several of our other generator actors already. Might not be obvious at first. So once again, I wouldn't even need to use the sequential trigger actor. I could simply have these trigger values connected directly to the pulse generators respectively to create the effect that I want to have in that way. If I only had two outputs and then plugging them both in, well, I've just made my patch even more efficient in this respect. And this is one of the ways that it's possible to simply go wild with these actors, because it's possible to make something that uses more actors than what you actually need to achieve the effect. Just like the wave generator, we can change the frequency of the pulse generator. If I turn this thing up to 10, it's going to go pretty fast. If I turn this thing back down to 0.33, it's going to go much slower, once every couple of seconds now. And of course, we can use the run stop of the pulse generator to turn it off entirely or to turn it on again. So sometimes you simply may want to have it running quite fast for a brief moment and then shut it off. You'll see that this was a really fun way to create kind of that flashing sort of lightning sort of effect in there as well. Now, finally, as a fun actor here, we have the decay generator. The decay generator is pretty subtle here in how it works. What happens with the decay generator is when we get the ink trigger value from our keyboard, whatever value is attached to the decay generator is going to increase by the increase amount, in this case 100. But then it is slowly going to decrease over time at a rate specified in the decrease amount property. Let's watch and see what happens here with our movie player. Pops the earth up to 100% intensity, but gradually fades it back down again. If in the process of fading down, it receives another trigger, it pops right back up to 100 again. By decreasing the increase amount, say to 5, I can now mash my keyboard to very slowly bring the Earth up to full brightness. And I'm going to have to keep pressing it, and then it will slowly fade back down again. So instead of mashing my A key, I could have used a pulse generator there that I turned off or on to produce similar automated results. It's a fun way in which we can combine multiple generators together in order to produce an interesting and complex effect. All right, so those are Isadora's powerful generator actors: the envelope generator, the decay generator, pulse generator, and the wave generator. These actors invite experimentation, and I encourage you to spend a little bit of time now playing around with your various trigger actors, such as the keyboard watcher, other interactive control actors like the mouse watcher, these various generators, and review the material in the value scaling tutorial to really play around with the complexities that are possible here. It is possible to create, using these generators, an interactive Rube Goldberg machine in Isadora. And you can find some of the other great videos here on YouTube by our other Isadora gurus like Mark Caniglio and Ryan Weber, who have created some fantastically complex patches using these generators. But they're also useful for very simple things as well. I invite you to experiment around with the actors and see just how much you can accomplish once the power is running with them. That's all for this week's tutorial. We'll see you at the next workshop.